Hello students and welcome to the today's online session. Myself Dr. S.R. Patil. I am working as assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry of S.V.K.T. Arts, Science and Commerce College, Devlali Camp, Nasik. Dear students, today's session for the TYBSc student and this topic from the course Chemistry for the Soil and Agrochemicals. The name of chapter is the fertilizers and manures. This chapter is included for the TYBSc student syllabus in the last 6th semester for the second term. Dear student, the session agenda for the today's lecture is that first we here discuss about the potassic fertilizers, then next point in the today's session we discuss is the classification of potassic fertilizers, then the reaction of potassic fertilizers in the soil. After that, in today's session we discuss about the complex fertilizers, mixed fertilizers, their advantages and disadvantages, and then after that we discuss about the time and the method of application of different fertilizers and the correct method of fertilizer applications. All these points we covered in the today's session. First, we start with the first point, potassic fertilizers. First, we discuss the definition of potassic fertilizers. We know that the potassic fertilizers are the chemical substance that containing the potassium in absorbed form. Okay. Then there are two potassic fertilizers. First one is the muriate of potash, that is the KCl, and the phosphate of potash, K2SO4. They are water soluble fertilizers and so are readily available to the plants. This is the general definition of potassic fertilizers. We know that the results through the statistical significant at the 5% level show the yield improvements with the application of these potassic fertilizers. The different level of potassium treatment caused quality improvements such as the higher specific weight and the more total solubles, that is the TSS. Next important point about the classification of potassic fertilizers. The potassic fertilizers are generally classified broadly into the chlorides and non-chlorides. In that the seaweeds, seawater, potassium minerals, processed fertilizers like the muriate and the sulfate of potash and the synthetic fertilizers are included. First one is the muriate of potash, second one is the sulfate of potash, and third one is the synthetic fertilizers. These are the class of the potassic fertilizer. Next important point is what fertilizers is high in potassium, and for that there are 13 good sources for the potassium. Okay, if a soil test reversal that your soil lacks the potassium, you will need to find a way to add these important nutrients to your garden. Luckily, there are many options available for high potassium fertilizers. So, what types of fertilizers having a high potassium? Fertilizers that are higher in potassium includes burn cucumber skins, sulfate of potash, magnesia, ylides, clay, wood ash, then the green sands, granite dust, sawdust, soybean meal, etc. are the fertilizers that have high potassium. Some of these fertilizers also containing nitrogen, phosphorus and other important nutrients for the plant. That means these are the source of other content also for required content for the crops. So, you can use a mixture of any of these sources of the potassium depending on its than what you have to available. So, we can use in the mixture form also to get the high percentage of potassium. So you can also use the fertilizers that formulated as the blossoms boosters, which will be also have a high potassium content. This is another alternative for the high potassium content. In this article, we will talk about some fertilizers that are high in potassium and exactly how much each one contain. That is examples of some potassium containing fertilizers. So you have also got an idea of how long it takes these fertilizers to release their nutrients into the soil. Here the N for the nitrogen, P for the phosphorus and K for the potassium, we know that very well. Also note that the percentage are by the weight. For example, the 100 pounds of the green sand containing the 5 pounds of the potassium. Okay, we know that the formula for the calculating the percentage. Next important point about the reaction of potash fertilizers in the soil. What type of reactions of these potash fertilizers in the soil is, what happen exactly in the soil? In the soil, the principal sources of the potassium are such a minerals as a feldspar, okay, and the micas, which release these element in the source of their weathering conditions, okay, and this process makes the potassium available to the plants. However, where the weathering process has been prolonged and extremes, as in the case of the utensils and the oxisols, in that the potassium may be leached away so that the soil require the addition of potassium in the form of fertilizers. That potassium is held in the soil by the cation exchange capacity, and the soil with finer particles such as the clay and the organic matters are able to hold the positively charged ions than the soil with the large particles such as the sand. First point is that the plants available, that means the mobile potassium fractions in the soil in the main source of the plant nutrient. Second one, the acid marine soils are the rich in the mobile potassium, but its availability is depending on the other soil parameters, especially on the soil reactions. Depending on the soil reactions, availability of the potassium. Third point about the finding from the fertilization trials suggests that the crop rotation yield is dependent on the mobile potassium content in the soil. Another important point in the percent experiments, the liming of the acid soil results in decrease of the potassium content in the top soil from the 400 milligrams per kg to the 200 milligram per kg. Next important point about the reaction of potash fertilizers in the soil. During the soil acidification process, the mobile potassium content mostly increased when the soil reaction reaches about the pH 4.5 to 4.7, and it is the decreases when the soil reaches the pH 5 to 5.5 and higher than this pH. Next important point about the reaction of potash fertilizers in the soil is under these conditions, under these pH conditions, the potassium fertilizer did not increase the crop yield. Then next one is the reaction of potassium content in the soil was observed as a result of primary and periodical liming due to the higher removal of these element with the yield. Next important point is that in the soil itself, potassium appears in three forms. First one is in the soil solution. Second one is as the exchange of potassium K plus ion absorbed to the or its release form, the surface of clay particles, and third form for availability of potassium is in organic matter. Okay, some layered aluminosilicates clay minerals may have the capacity to absorb this potassium not only on their outer surface but also inside the layered clay lattice also. Okay, and thereby causing the immobilization or fixing of that potassium ions. This is about the three different forms of the availability of potassium in the soil. Next important type is the complex fertilizers. What is meant by complex fertilizer? We know that the complex fertilizer contain 2 or 3 primary plant nutrients, of which 2 primary nutrients, plant nutrients, are in the chemical combination. That is the complex fertilizers, and these fertilizers are usually produced in a granular form. Okay, and these are the some example of these complex fertilizer. For example, the diammonium phosphate, which is called as a DAP. Another one is a nitrophosphate, and the ammonium phosphate are the example of complex fertilizer. Next important point about the technical characteristic of these complex fertilizers. First, these complex fertilizers have better physical features. Then their role is to neutralize the physiological acidity. Third important feature is that they have a higher ratio of using the nutrients, and they do not leave the residue in the soil. This is the most important characteristic feature of these complex fertilizers. The complex fertilizers comes as a granules of different colors according to the adsorbents. Okay, that means the concentration of the nutrient element contained in the chemical formula. This is important features of that complex fertilizers, characteristic features. Next important point about the advantages of these complex fertilizers. What are the advantages for using these complex fertilizers? Their applications is easy and economical. It's the most important advantage because the same content of nutrients needs to 2/3 times lesser efforts to apply in the soil. Another important advantage is it ensures a more even the distribute of the nutrients on the ground. The fertilizers, due to the fact that more fertilizing elements is there, and it increase the efficacy or introduce the compatibilities, and that means the combination nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. Next important point of fertilizers is a mixed fertilizers. First, we discussed the disadvantage of complex fertilizers. In previous slide, we discussed about the advantages of complex fertilizers. There are two disadvantages of complex fertilizer. First one is the plants differs ratio of the consuming nitrogen, the phosphorus and the potassium, and that ratio is depending according to the plant species and the age. This is the disadvantage of complex fertilizers. And next point is the mixed fertilizers. What do you mean by mixed fertilizer? Mixed fertilizers are the mixture of two or more straight fertilizers, and these mixed fertilizers is highly useful for the good crop yield and the plant growth. The requirements of these fertilizers is very less. These are the mixed fertilizer. Next important point, they rectify the residual acidity of certain nitrogenous fertilizers in the soil. Along with that, they supply the balanced amount of nutrient to the plants and soil. Let's consider some disadvantage of that mixed fertilizer. First one is that they do not permit the application of individual nutrients, okay, and which may suits for need of a crop of the specific time. Another disadvantage of mixed fertilizers is that the unit cost of that plant nutrients, the mixture, is usually higher than those of the straight fertilizer. That means the matter of cost or the economy. Next important disadvantage of that mixed fertilizer is that farmers do not mix the fertilizers in proper proportion, because the proportion of the mixing is most important and farmers are not mixed that proportion properly. This is the disadvantage of mixed fertilizer. Another differential application of fertilizer mixture is not possible. In a mixing, chemical compatibility results in the reduction in the availability of some neutralizant, because the proportion of the mixing is not proper, and due to that the compatibility in the reduction in the availability of some neutralizants is the result. Then the chemical reaction between the fertilizers may cause the loss of nutrient, and to avoid all these disadvantages, the agricultural department has prepared a list of approved fertilizer mixtures with the definite compositions. This is the guideline for the farmer to mix the fertilizers from the agriculture department. Next important point about the time and method of application of fertilizers, because the application of fertilizer time is most important, and method also most important, in which method we can apply the fertilizers for the guideline for the farmers. To obtain a maximum benefit from the fertilizers, it must be applied at a proper place and in a proper proportion. So the application of fertilizer depending on the three things. First one is the nature of the fertilizer, second one is the type of the soil, and last one is the type and nature of the field crop. Which type of crop is taken by the farmers is most important. How to apply the fertilizers with the which one methods. So, selection of the time for application of fertilizer depending on the stages of the plant growth. In that the plant requires less nitrogen in the early stage growth and harvesting time, but the maximum during its growth period. So, the nitrogen is required by the plant throughout their lifetime. Therefore, the nitrogenous fertilizer will be applied in a split doses through the growth period as to remove the nitrogen deficiency from the plant. Okay, and for more amount of the phosphorus is required during the early growth period of the crops. Therefore, the phosphatic fertilizers are slow releasing fertilizers, and therefore they must be applied as a superphosphate before regular operations for these extra labor is needed for this activity. And the potash is an intermediate fertilizer between the nitrogen and phosphorus. So, it should also be applied during the sowing time. Sandy soils require the more frequent application of all the types of fertilizers to avoid the loss of nutrient through the leaching. As in the earlier slide, we also discussed the timing of that application of fertilizer is depending upon the type of soil also. So, this is one of the example of a sandy soil in which type of soil is required the fertilizers. So, this is a guideline provided by the agriculture department to the farmers how they can apply these fertilizers with a proper timing. Next important point is the method of application of these fertilizers. Nitrogenous fertilizers being highly soluble reach the plant root easily and rapidly. Therefore, they are broadcast on the soil surface just before sowing period. To overcome this deficiency of nitrogen at a later stages of the plant growth, it is top decreased and side pressed phosphate is also releasing the fertilizers, and therefore it is placed near the seed or the seeding root for their for these reasons. Some important point to be considered. First important point is the restrict the contact of the fertilizers with the soil less is their fixation of the phosphate. Next important point to be considered is the necessary plant food is placed within easy reach of the plant roots. Another important point, the possibility of the injurious concentration is minimized if the placement is accurately controlled. And the last one is the fertilizer placed in a side band along the row does not readily furnish nutrients to weeds growing between the rows. So, application method is and the place is most important about the application method during the fertilization. Then the potassic fertilizer should also be placed near the root zone as they are mobile. First method of applying fertilizer for the solid form is that there are three methods. First one is the broadcasting method, second one is the placement, and third one is the localized placement form. These are the for the solid form fertilizers. Second method for application of fertilizers for the liquid fertilizers, in that there are four methods. First one is the starter solution form, second one is the foliar application or the spray fertilizers, third method is the direct application to the soil, and fourth method for the liquid fertilizer application is application through the irrigation water. These are the two methods for application of fertilizers for the solid form and liquid form. So, in the next point of the session, we discuss about the summary of today's lecture. First, here we discuss about the potassic fertilizers, their definition of potassic fertilizer along with the examples. In the next point, today we discuss about the classification of potassic fertilizers. Okay, there are three classes of potassic fertilizers. Then next important point we discuss in today's session is that what type of fertilizer is high in potassium. So, there are 13 different sources here we discuss for the potassium. Then next important point, the reaction of that potash fertilizers in the soil. Next important point we discuss here is that the complex fertilizers. their examples and their advantages and disadvantages. Along with that, we discuss about the mixed fertilizers, their definitions, their examples, their advantages and disadvantages. After that, important point regarding the fertilizers we discussed, that is the time and mode of the application of fertilizer. Which time, exact time for the application of proper fertilizers, which depending upon the 3 different factors. And after that last point here, we discuss about the correct method of fertilizer application. Here we discuss the different methods for the application of solid forms and liquid forms of fertilizer. So all these points here we covered it in our today's session. So next important point is the session assignment depending on the today's session. On the today's session, on the basis of today's session, we have to solve 4 questions. First question is define the potassic fertilizer. In that we have to only discuss the definition of potassic fertilizers and write down the 2 examples of the potassic fertilizers. Second question you have to solve, that is explain the classification of potassic fertilizer. In that we have to write down the exact what is mean by potassic fertilizers and their classes. There are 3 classes of potassic fertilizer here we discuss. We have to write down all these 3 classes. Then question third is that explain the complex fertilizers and its advantages. In that we have to exactly write down the definition of complex fertilizers and their examples, and then we have to write down the 4 to 5 advantages of the complex fertilizers. In the next question, we have to explain the mixed fertilizers, about the mixed fertilizer and its advantages. Here we have to also write down the exact meaning of the mixed fertilizers. We have to explain some example of mixed fertilizer and write down the 4 to 5 advantages of mixed fertilizer. So this is a session assignment for the student. You have to solve all these 4 questions and send me all the question answers on the Google Classroom for the TYBSc class. Okay, so this is a session assignment. In the next session, we discuss about the manures which are used in the agriculture field. So thank you very much.